Picture this. It's 2 a.m. on a freezing December night in 1828. Two men are crouched in a muddy graveyard in Edinburgh, their breath visible in the cold air. One's holding a lantern, while the other works furiously with a shovel. They're not here to pay respects to the dead there, here to steal them. And here's the thing that's going to blow your mind. Every single medical breakthrough that's ever saved your life, every surgery that's ever been performed, every pill you've ever taken, it all started with men like these. It's violating graves in the dead of night. What I'm about to tell you isn't some urban legend or ghost story. This is real history. History that medical schools don't like to talk about. History that reveals the disturbing truth about how modern medicine was really born. Okay, let's set the scene. We're talking about the 1700s and 1800s in Europe and America. Medicine is finally starting to break free from medieval nonsense. No bloodletting, drilling holes in people's heads to release evil spirits, that kind of thing. Doctors are beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, they should actually know how the human body works before they start cutting people open. But there's one massive problem standing in their way. And I mean massive. To learn medicine, you need to study dead bodies. Real ones. Fresh ones. You can't learn surgery from a textbook drawing, and you sure as hell can't understand how organs work by looking at sketches that look like they were drawn by a drunk medieval monk. Here's where it gets absolutely insane. In Britain, the only bodies that could legally be used for medical education were executed murderers. That's it. In a country of millions of people, medical schools got maybe, and I'm not exaggerating, here 6 to 10 bodies per year, total, for every medical school in the entire country. Think about that for a second. You've got hundreds of medical students packed into lecture halls, all trying to learn how to save lives. And they're sharing 6 decomposing corpses for the whole year. Can you imagine trying to learn brain surgery by getting a 5-second glimpse at a rotting criminal's? A skull that's been sitting around for months? This wasn't just inconvenient, this was keeping medicine in the dark ages. People were dying from diseases that could have been cured if doctors actually understood how the human body worked.
Oh.
But the law said no. The church said no. Society said absolutely not. So what happened? Well, where there's desperate demand and zero legal supply, you get a black market. And this particular black market was about to become one of the most organized, sophisticated criminal enterprises in history. Enter the Resurrection Men. Now, before you start picturing some random thugs with shovels, let me stop you right there. These weren't your typical criminals. These were skilled professionals who turned grave robbing into an art form. They had organizational charts, specialized equipment, detailed reconnaissance procedures, and business models that would make modern corporations jealous. Some of the most successful body-snatching operations were more sophisticated than legitimate businesses of the time. Let me walk you through how this actually worked, because the details are absolutely wild. First, the scouting phase.
These guys
Would spend their days walking through cemeteries like they were tourists. They were actually conducting military-level reconnaissance. They'd note which graves were fresh, study the soil composition, memorize guard patrol routes, most importantly, observe the grieving families. See, families back then knew about body snatchers. They'd often post guards at fresh graves for weeks, taking shifts to protect their loved ones. So the Resurrection Men had to become amateur psychologists, studying grief patterns, figuring out exactly when exhausted family members would finally give up their vigil. Then came the planning phase. They'd study weather patterns they preferred. Cloudy, moonless nights, obviously, but also rainy nights because the sound of digging would be masked. They'd map out escape routes, identify which nearby roads had the least traffic, even figure out which taverns the local constables frequented, so they'd know where to avoid. Now here's where it gets really clever. They didn't dig up entire graves. That would take hours and leave obvious evidence. Instead, they developed this technique where they'd only dig down to the head of the coffin. Then they'd break open just that small section, tie ropes around the corpse's head and shoulders, and literally yank the body out through the tiny opening. The whole operation, from start to finish, could be completed in under an hour. They'd even bring canvas sacks to carry the bodies. And here's the really morbid part. They'd strip the corpses naked and leave the clothes behind. Why? Because stealing a dead body was a misdemeanor, but stealing the clothes off a dead body was a felony. I'm not making this up. These guys had lawyers. But here's what makes this story truly disturbing. The medical establishment wasn't just turning a blind eye to this, they were actively participating. Respected professors, hospital administrators, pillars of society, they were all part of what was essentially an organized crime syndicate. Take Dr. Robert Knox in Edinburgh. This guy was like the rock star of anatomy professors. Students would pack his lectures because he always had the freshest, most perfect specimens to dissect. And everyone knew exactly why. Knox was paying premium prices to body snatchers. No questions asked. He was so desperate for fresh corpses that he'd pay the equivalent of what a working man would make in 3 months. The economics were absolutely insane. Body snatching became more profitable than most legitimate trades. Some of these guys were making more money than doctors. They lived double lives: respectable tradesmen during the day, wealthy criminals at night, and society's response. Well, this is where it gets really dark. Instead of changing the laws that created this problem in the first place, they just tried to make grave robbing harder. Wealthy families started buying iron coffins that cost more than most people's houses. They built elaborate fortress-like tombs with heavy stone slabs and iron bars. Some hired private guards to patrol cemeteries. The rich literally turned graveyards into military installations. But the poor, they were completely defenseless. Their loved ones were buried in simple wooden coffins in public cemeteries with no protection whatsoever. Entire working-class neighborhoods lived in absolute terror that their family members wouldn't be allowed to rest in peace. Churches started hiring watchmen. Families would take turns guarding graves in shifts, sometimes for weeks, until the bodies decomposed enough to be useless for dissection. Communities built these things called mort safes, basically iron cages that went over graves, turning cemeteries into open-air prisons for the dead. The paranoia became so intense that it changed funeral practices forever. All those elaborate Victorian mourning rituals, those massive ornate coffins, those fortress-like mausoleums. A huge part of that obsession came from this era of body snatching. People weren't just mourning the dead, they were trying to protect them from being stolen. But wait, because this story is about to take an even darker turn. In 1827, in Edinburgh, 2 men named William Burke and William Hare decided that digging up bodies was too much work. Why rob graves when you could just fresh corpses? They started murdering people and selling the bodies to Dr. Knox. 16 people died before they were caught. Burke was executed, but here's the kicker. His body was publicly dissected at Edinburgh Medical College. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a scalpel. And Dr. Knox is the man who bought 16 murdered bodies without asking a single question. He faced no legal consequences whatsoever. The medical establishment protected him because they couldn't afford to lose their supply chain. This is when society finally started to wake up to what they'd created. The Burke and Hare murders weren't an anomaly. They were the inevitable result of a system that valued medical progress over human dignity, that allowed an entire criminal underworld to flourish because it was more convenient than changing unjust laws. Here's the twist that's going to mess with your head. The body snatchers weren't the villains of this story. They were solving a problem that society was too cowardly to address honestly. Every medical breakthrough you've ever benefited from understanding how the heart works, how to perform surgery, how to treat cancer, how to transplant organs, all of it required the knowledge that was gained from those stolen corpses. When you go to a hospital today and receive life-saving treatment, you're benefiting from discoveries that were made by cutting open bodies that were dragged from graveyards, by criminals in the middle of the night. The doctors whose names are on hospital wings and medical schools, they built their reputations on corpses that were literally stolen from grieving families. Think about that. Our ability to save lives was built on a foundation of violating death. The craziest part? This whole nightmare could have been solved with a simple change in the law. Just allow medical schools to use unclaimed bodies from hospitals and poorhouses. That's it. Problem solved. But it took decades of grave robbing, countless violated graves, and 16 murders before politicians finally did the obvious thing. In 1832, Britain passed the Anatomy Act. Similar laws followed across Europe and America. Almost overnight, the resurrection men disappeared, not because society suddenly grew a conscience, but because they were no longer needed. You know what keeps me up at night about this story? It's not grave robbing. It's not even the murders. It's willful blindness. For decades, everyone knew what was happening. Medical students knew their cadavers weren't legally obtained. Cases knew they were buying stolen bodies. Politicians knew the laws needed to change. Families knew their loved ones. Graves were being violated, but they all chose to look away because confronting the truth was too uncomfortable. It was easier to let criminals carry the moral burden in the shadows than to have an honest conversation about what medical progress actually required. And here's what really gets me. We're still doing this. Right now, today, we're benefiting from systems and practices that we'd rather not examine too closely. The smartphone you're watching this on is probably made with minerals mined by children in Africa. The cheap clothes in your closet is probably sewn by people working in conditions that would horrify you. The food you eat, the technology you use, the medicine you take. How much of our modern comfort is built on suffering we choose not to see? The resurrection men disappeared, but they left us with an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes progress requires us to do things that feel morally wrong. Sometimes the choice isn't between good and evil, but between different kinds of moral compromise. Those bodies stolen from Edinburgh graveyards taught doctors how to save millions of lives. The graves violated in London cemeteries helped us conquer diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries. The moral boundaries crossed by desperate criminals allowed medicine to advance from medieval superstition into the science that keeps you alive today. Every time you visit a doctor, every time surgery saves someone you love, every time a medical breakthrough prevents suffering, you're connected to those moonless nights in Greyfriars Kirkyard, to those desperate men with shovels and ropes, to the systematic violation of the dead in service of the living. The resurrection men forced society to confront an impossible question. What are we willing to sacrifice for progress? What moral boundaries are we willing to cross when lives hang in the balance? Maybe most importantly, what are we choosing not to see today? What moral compromises are we making right now that future generations will judge us for? Because I guarantee you, 100 years from now, people will look back at our time and ask the same questions we're asking about the resurrection. Men, how could they have known what was happening and done nothing? How could they have benefited from systems they knew were wrong? How could they have been so willfully blind? The past is never as simple as we want it to be, and neither is the present. What do you think? Was it worth it? Are there moral boundaries that should never be crossed, even for medical progress? Or are there times when the ends justify the means, no matter how dark those means might be? Let me know in the comments. And if this story has changed how you think about the hidden costs of progress, hit that subscribe button, because history is full of uncomfortable truths that we need to confront, especially when they make us question everything we think we know. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.